Welcome, dear listeners, to the English Globe. I'm Adam, and I'm glad you're here with us today. If you like learning English through current world events, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us make more episodes like this. Also, if you have ideas for topics you want us to cover, please share them in the comments below. We love hearing from you. Today, we will discuss a major and serious event shaking the Middle East. The United States has directly hit Iran's nuclear infrastructure with a military strike. This is a huge development that changes the balance of power in the region and could affect global security. It's important to understand why this happened, what it means, and how different countries are reacting.
Hello everyone, I'm Julia. This event marks a significant turning point in the long-standing tensions between the US and Iran. For many years, the focus has been on negotiations and sanctions, but this strike is a direct military action against Iran's nuclear program. Iran strongly condemned the attack, calling it an act of aggression and a violation of international law. The world is watching closely what happens next.
In this episode, we will guide you step by step through this complex situation. First, we'll explain the history of the US-Iran nuclear conflict. Then, we'll describe the recent attack, Iran's response, and how the international community is reacting. Finally, we'll discuss what this could mean for peace, security, and the future of the Middle East. Stay with us to learn both English and world news clearly. To understand why the recent U.S. strike on Iran's nuclear infrastructure is so important, we need to look back at the history of the nuclear conflict between the two countries. The tension did not start overnight. It goes back more than 2 decades, rooted in a complicated mix of politics, security concerns, and regional power struggles. After the Iranian Revolution in 1979, the relationship between the United States and Iran worsened drastically. The U.S. cut diplomatic ties with Iran after the hostage crisis, where American embassy staff were held captive for over a year. Since then, distrust has been the foundation of their interactions.
In the 2000s, international attention focused on Iran's nuclear program. Iran insisted its nuclear development was for peaceful purposes like generating electricity and medical research. However, many countries, including the US, suspected that Iran wanted to build nuclear weapons. These suspicions created fear across the world because a nuclear-armed Iran could destabilize the entire Middle East, a region already filled with conflicts and rivalries.
In 2015, an important agreement known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, was signed between Iran and 6 world powers, including the United States. This deal aimed to limit Iran's nuclear activities, allowing inspections and reducing uranium enrichment in exchange for lifting economic sanctions. The deal was seen as a diplomatic success by many because it slowed Iran's nuclear program and opened the door to negotiations rather than military conflict.
However, the situation changed dramatically in 2018 when the US, under President Donald Trump, decided to withdraw from the JCPOA. Trump criticized the agreement as the worst deal ever and reimposed harsh sanctions on Iran. These sanctions targeted Iran's economy, especially its oil exports, putting severe pressure on the Iranian government. In response, Iran began reducing its compliance with the deal, increasing uranium enrichment beyond the limits set by the JCPOA.
The withdrawal and re-escalation of tensions led to a dangerous cycle. Iran increased its nuclear activities and military presence in the region. The U.S. responded by increasing its military forces around the Persian Gulf, and there were several confrontations, including attacks on oil tankers and the downing of drones. The relationship between the two countries became more hostile, raising fears of a possible war.
In 2020, the situation reached a new level of crisis when the US carried out a drone strike that killed Qasem Soleimani, a top Iranian general and powerful figure in the region. Iran vowed revenge, and there were missile attacks on US bases in Iraq. Since then, The two countries have remained on high alert, with periodic clashes and continued threats.
Throughout this period, Iran's nuclear program continued to develop. The country advanced its uranium enrichment capabilities and expanded its nuclear facilities. International inspectors faced difficulties accessing some sites, raising further concerns. Many world leaders warned that Iran was getting closer to having the technology needed for a nuclear weapon, which would be a significant change in regional power dynamics.
This history sets the stage for the recent US strike. The US government says it had new intelligence, proving that Iran was moving towards developing nuclear weapons faster than previously thought. The strike was intended to slow down or stop Iran's progress and send a clear message that the US will not allow Iran to become a nuclear threat. For Iran, the attack is seen as a severe violation of its sovereignty and a dangerous escalation.
This background also explains why reactions around the world are so mixed. Some countries support the US action as necessary to prevent nuclear proliferation. Others fear it could spark a wider conflict that destabilizes the Middle East even more. The history of broken agreements and mistrust makes diplomatic solutions harder but more urgent than ever.
As we continue in this podcast, we will look closely at the details of the recent strike, Iran's response, and the possible consequences for international security. Understanding this long history helps us see why this moment is so significant and why it is important to follow the news carefully.
Now that we have a clear understanding of the background, let's focus on what exactly happened during the recent US strike on Iran's nuclear infrastructure. This event marks a major escalation, the first direct military strike on Iran's nuclear facilities in many years. The strike occurred in the early hours of the morning, local time, catching much of the world by surprise. According to official statements, U.S. forces targeted several key locations involved in Iran's uranium enrichment and nuclear research programs. The main site hit was a heavily fortified underground facility known for its role in uranium enrichment. Uranium enrichment is the process used to increase the concentration of uranium-235, a key element for nuclear energy and weapons. Intelligence reports suggested that Iran was rapidly expanding its enrichment activities at this site, increasing the risk that it could develop a nuclear weapon sooner than previously estimated.
The strike used precision-guided missiles and drones to minimize civilian casualties and avoid widespread destruction. However, reports indicate that significant damage was done to centrifuges, the machines used for uranium enrichment. Several other nearby facilities linked to Iran's nuclear research were also targeted, including buildings used for storing enriched uranium and laboratories working on nuclear technology. The US government explained that the operation was carefully planned to reduce the possibility of escalation while still achieving the goal of slowing down Iran's nuclear program. They said the intelligence supporting the strike was solid, based on satellite images, intercepted communications, and information from human sources inside Iran.
Iran's reaction was swift and strong. The government condemned the strike as an illegal act of war and vowed to respond with full force. State media broadcast scenes of damage and called for national unity against what they described as American aggression. Iranian leaders warned that this attack crossed a red line and could lead to serious consequences for regional stability. In the days following the strike, Iran announced it would resume uranium enrichment to higher levels than ever before, ignoring previous agreements and international demands. This declaration alarmed many countries and international organizations because it signaled that Iran might speed up its path toward nuclear weapons capability.
The international community reacted with concern and calls for restraint. European countries, who had supported the JCPOA deal, urged both Iran and the US to avoid further military conflict and return to diplomatic talks. The United Nations Security Council held emergency meetings to discuss the crisis, but no immediate consensus was reached, as some members blamed Iran for violating agreements while others criticized the US for using military force. Neighboring countries in the Middle East also voiced their opinions. Some supported the US action, viewing Iran as a threat to regional security, while others feared that the strike might trigger retaliation and a broader conflict involving multiple countries.
The strike also affected global markets and security concerns worldwide. Oil prices spiked immediately after the news broke, reflecting worries about possible disruptions in the Persian Gulf, one of the world's most important oil shipping routes. Governments around the world increased security measures at their embassies and military bases, fearing retaliatory attacks from Iran or its allied groups. Intelligence agencies globally increased their monitoring of Iran and the region. Many analysts believe that this strike is only the beginning of a new phase of confrontation, with both sides prepared for a longer and more dangerous struggle.
On social media and news outlets, the strike sparked intense debate. Supporters of the US praised the action as necessary to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons that could threaten global peace. Critics warned that the strike risks pushing Iran to retaliate violently, potentially dragging the Middle East into open war. Human rights groups expressed concern over the impact on civilians and called for peaceful resolution. For ordinary people in the Middle East, the strike has increased anxiety. Many fear that the conflict could escalate and cause widespread suffering. International organizations began preparing humanitarian responses in case the situation worsens.
In summary, the recent U.S. strike on Iran's nuclear infrastructure is a significant and risky move with far-reaching consequences. It has damaged key nuclear facilities, provoked a strong response from Iran, and unsettled international relations. The full impact of this event will unfold in the coming weeks and months, but it is clear that this moment represents a critical turning point in the ongoing tensions between the United States and Iran. Following the U.S. strike on its nuclear infrastructure, Iran's response was immediate and forceful. Iranian leaders condemned the attack as a blatant violation of their sovereignty and an act of aggression that threatens peace and stability in the region. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei described the strike as a dangerous and unjustifiable act and vowed that Iran would retaliate at the right time and place. This rhetoric heightened fears that the conflict could escalate into open warfare. Iran's government also took concrete steps in response. Within hours of the strike, Iran announced that it would no longer adhere to the limits set by the 2015 nuclear agreement, the JCPOA. Specifically, Iran declared that it would enrich uranium to 60%, a level much closer to weapons-grade material, which is a clear departure from previous agreements and a serious cause for international concern.
Militarily, Iran mobilized several of its forces in the region, including the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, a powerful military organization with significant influence over Iran's strategic decisions. The IRGC issued warnings that any further attacks would be met with decisive and crushing retaliation. Reports emerged of missile tests and increased military exercises near the Strait of Hormuz, a critical waterway through which a significant portion of the world's oil supply passes. In addition to official military responses, Iran's allied groups and proxy forces in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen also increased their activities. These groups have long served as extensions of Iran's influence in the region and are known to carry out attacks against US and allied forces. Since the strike, there have been reports of increased rocket attacks on military bases hosting American personnel, raising concerns about a widening conflict beyond Iran's borders.
The reaction of neighboring countries in the Middle East has been mixed and complex. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, which are regional rivals of Iran, expressed cautious support for the U.S. strike. They see Iran's nuclear ambitions as a threat to their security and the stability of the region. However, even these countries warned against further escalation, emphasizing the need for dialogue and diplomatic solutions. On the other hand, Countries like Iraq and Oman called for restraint and dialogue. Iraq, where many Iranian-backed militias operate, was particularly concerned about the risk of escalating violence on its soil. Iraqi political leaders urged both Washington and Tehran to avoid actions that could plunge the region into conflict.
Turkey and other regional powers took a more neutral stance, urging both sides to de-escalate tensions and return to diplomatic negotiations. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which includes many Muslim-majority countries, also called for calm and condemned the use of military force. They emphasized the importance of respecting national sovereignty and resolving disputes through dialogue. Internationally, countries such as Russia and China criticized the US strike as a violation of international law. Both countries have close ties with Iran and have opposed US sanctions and military actions in the region. They called for peaceful negotiations and warned against unilateral military interventions that could destabilize global security.
This broad and varied response highlights the fragile and complex nature of Middle Eastern geopolitics. The US-Iran conflict is not just a bilateral issue. It involves many countries with competing interests, alliances, and historical grievances. Any military action risks triggering a chain reaction, drawing in multiple countries and proxy forces, making the region even more unstable. Many analysts worry that this strike could lead to a wider war, which would have devastating consequences not only for the Middle East, but for global peace and economic stability. The Persian Gulf, already one of the most volatile regions in the world, could become a battlefield, threatening international shipping lanes and energy supplies.
Despite these fears, some experts believe the strike was intended as a warning rather than a full-scale attack. They argue that the US wanted to send a clear message to Iran and the international community about its red lines without triggering a broader conflict. This strategy relies on deterrence, hoping that Iran will reconsider its nuclear ambitions and return to negotiations to avoid further destruction. Diplomatic efforts continue behind the scenes, with European countries and the United Nations trying to mediate between the two sides. There is a shared understanding that a military conflict would be disastrous and that peaceful solutions must be found. However, the path to diplomacy is complicated by decades of mistrust, broken agreements, and ongoing regional rivalries.
For ordinary people living in the Middle East, this situation brings uncertainty and fear. Families worry about the possibility of war, economic hardships, and disruptions to daily life. Humanitarian organizations are preparing for potential crises, including displacement and shortages of food, water, and medical supplies. As we watch these events unfold, it is crucial to stay informed, understand the complexities, and hope for peaceful solutions. The coming weeks will be critical in determining whether the US and Iran can avoid further violence, or whether this strike marks the beginning of a new, dangerous chapter in Middle Eastern history. As the situation between the United States and Iran escalates following the recent strike on Iran's nuclear infrastructure, the international community has stepped forward with a mix of concern, calls for diplomacy, and strategic positioning. This moment in history has brought global powers, regional actors, and international organizations into sharp focus, revealing both cooperation and tension on the world stage. Understanding their roles helps us grasp how complex and interconnected the crisis truly is. Countries across the globe are deeply invested in preventing this conflict from spiraling into full-scale war. The stakes are incredibly high, not just for regional peace, but for global security and economic stability. Many nations rely on the Middle East for energy supplies, trade routes, and geopolitical alliances, making it vital for them to influence the situation toward a peaceful resolution.
One of the most active players in this diplomatic effort is the European Union. Since the US withdrew from the 2015 JCPOA agreement under the previous administration, European countries have been trying to keep the deal alive and encourage Iran to adhere to its terms. The EU's foreign policy chief, called for immediate restraint from both the US and Iran, emphasizing the importance of dialogue over military action. European diplomats have been working tirelessly to restart talks between Tehran and Washington, despite deep mistrust. They understand that isolating Iran further through sanctions or military strikes might push the country closer to developing nuclear weapons, which would be catastrophic for regional security. The EU's approach is centered on preserving multilateral agreements and strengthening international institutions.
The United Nations has also been at the forefront of international efforts to address the crisis. The UN Secretary-General has issued urgent calls for de-escalation, emphasizing that war is not the solution and that peaceful negotiation remains the only viable path. The Security Council, however, faces significant challenges in achieving a consensus due to the differing interests of its permanent members. Russia and China, both permanent members with veto power, have consistently opposed unilateral military actions and sanctions targeting Iran. They argue that such moves violate Iran's sovereignty and international law. Their diplomatic stance complicates efforts to impose harsher measures or take collective military action. Both countries have urged all parties to return to negotiations and maintain the JCPOA framework.
In addition to global powers, regional organizations have played a critical role. The Gulf Cooperation Council, GCC, which includes Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, and Qatar, is watching the situation closely. Although these countries are often divided in their approach to Iran, they share concerns about Iran's nuclear program and its influence in regional conflicts. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have publicly supported the US strike as a necessary step to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. However, they have also cautioned against escalating the conflict and urged diplomatic efforts to avoid a broader war. The GCC has called for dialogue and peaceful solutions, recognizing that regional stability depends on cooperation among all states.
Interestingly, countries like Turkey and Iraq have positioned themselves as potential mediators. Turkey maintains a complex relationship with both Iran and the West, and has historically acted as a bridge between different powers in the region. Turkish leaders have called for calm and proposed hosting peace talks to ease tensions. Iraq, heavily influenced by both Iran and the US, is especially vulnerable to escalation. Iraqi officials have expressed concern that continued conflict could destabilize their country, which is still recovering from years of war and internal conflict. Baghdad has urged both Tehran and Washington to show restraint and work through diplomatic channels.
Beyond government actions, non-governmental organizations and think tanks worldwide have contributed to discussions on how to manage the crisis. Experts on nuclear non-proliferation warn that this strike, while intended to delay Iran's nuclear progress, could have unintended consequences. For example, it might lead Iran to speed up uranium enrichment or withdraw from international monitoring agreements, making it harder to track its nuclear activities. Human rights organizations emphasize the need to consider the humanitarian impact of any conflict. They highlight how ordinary civilians often suffer the most during wars and call on all parties to prioritize peace and protect human lives. These groups also stress the importance of maintaining aid and humanitarian access in any conflict zone.
Meanwhile, economic organizations monitor the ripple effects of the strike on global markets. The immediate spike in oil prices is a clear indication of how fragile global energy security is. Many countries are preparing for possible disruptions in supply and increased costs, which could affect everything from transportation to food prices worldwide. International financial institutions are also watching carefully, as prolonged conflict in the Middle East could disrupt trade routes like the Suez Canal and the Strait of Hormuz. These choke points are vital for the flow of goods, and any closure or blockade could have serious consequences for global commerce.
Amid these challenges, some diplomatic backchannels remain open. quiet talks have reportedly taken place in neutral countries, involving representatives from the US, Iran, and European nations. While public statements remain tense, behind-the-scenes negotiations aim to find common ground and avoid further military confrontations. These efforts reflect the understanding that neither side truly benefits from war. The US wants to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons, but also seeks to avoid a costly military conflict. Iran aims to advance its nuclear technology while maintaining its sovereignty and regional influence without facing overwhelming international isolation or attack.
As listeners, it's important to recognize that the international community's role is complicated by decades of distrust, conflicting interests, and geopolitical rivalries. The challenge lies in balancing the demands for security, respect for sovereignty, and the urgent need for peace. Whether these efforts will succeed remains uncertain, but the stakes could not be higher. The coming weeks and months will test the resilience of diplomatic channels and the willingness of all parties to compromise. Global powers, regional actors, and international organizations must work together to prevent further escalation and foster dialogue. Only through cooperation can this dangerous turning point in the Middle East lead to a safer and more stable future. The recent U.S. strike on Iran's nuclear infrastructure marks a significant turning point with far-reaching consequences for global security. This action reverberates well beyond the borders of the Middle East, affecting the delicate balance of power between nations and raising concerns about nuclear proliferation worldwide. The international community now faces the complex challenge of addressing not only regional instability, but also the risk of a broader security crisis that could destabilize global peace for years to come. At the heart of these concerns is the fear that Iran's nuclear program could trigger an arms race in the Middle East. Several countries in the region already possess advanced military capabilities, and some are suspected of pursuing or considering nuclear weapons programs of their own. If Iran successfully develops a nuclear arsenal, it could prompt neighbors such as Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt to accelerate their own nuclear ambitions, further escalating tensions.
This potential domino effect threatens to unravel decades of non-proliferation efforts led by international bodies such as the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, and the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, NPT. These institutions aim to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and promote peaceful uses of nuclear energy, but the current crisis exposes their vulnerabilities. In particular, Iran's decision to enrich uranium beyond the limits set by the JCPOA undermines the trust that is essential for effective monitoring and verification. Without transparent inspections and compliance, the world loses the ability to accurately assess Iran's nuclear capabilities, increasing the risk of misunderstandings and miscalculations that could lead to conflict.
Beyond the nuclear dimension, the U.S. strike and the subsequent escalation have heightened concerns about terrorism and proxy warfare in the region. Iran's network of allied militias and proxy groups across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen could respond with increased attacks on U.S. forces and interests. This not only threatens the safety of military personnel, but also risks drawing multiple countries into a protracted conflict. Such proxy conflicts have already caused tremendous suffering, with civilian populations bearing the brunt of violence, displacement, and economic hardship. Renewed hostilities could exacerbate humanitarian crises and strain international aid efforts, complicating efforts to stabilize the region.
The impact on global economic stability is equally significant. The Middle East is a critical hub for the world's energy supplies, with vast reserves of oil and natural gas. The Strait of Hormuz, in particular, is a vital choke point through which roughly 20% of the world's petroleum passes. Any disruption in this waterway due to military action or retaliation could lead to skyrocketing energy prices and supply shortages. The spike in oil prices following the U.S. strike reflects these fears. Higher energy costs not only affect transportation and manufacturing, but also increase the price of everyday goods, placing additional financial strain on consumers worldwide. Countries that rely heavily on oil imports are particularly vulnerable to such shocks.
Global financial markets have reacted with volatility as investors weigh the risks of escalating conflict against economic growth prospects. Uncertainty in the Middle East often leads to risk aversion, with capital flowing away from emerging markets and into safe haven assets like gold and government bonds. Moreover, prolonged instability in the region could disrupt key trade routes beyond energy supplies. The Suez Canal, connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, is a crucial artery for global shipping. Any conflict that threatens the security of these routes could have cascading effects on international trade, supply chains, and manufacturing industries worldwide.
Governments and multinational corporations are now closely monitoring developments to assess the impact on their operations and supply chains. Companies in sectors such as energy, logistics, finance, and manufacturing face increased risks, prompting contingency planning and efforts to diversify supply sources. Insurance costs for shipping and trade in the region have also risen, reflecting the heightened risks of piracy, blockades, or attacks on vessels. These increased costs often trickle down to consumers, further contributing to inflationary pressures globally.
In response to these challenges, many countries are reconsidering their energy policies and strategic reserves. Efforts to boost alternative energy sources and increase production in more stable regions have gained urgency. For instance, the US and European countries are accelerating investments in renewable energy, while some Gulf states are expanding oil production capacity to stabilize markets. However, such transitions take time, and in the short term, the world remains heavily dependent on Middle Eastern oil. This dependency underscores the strategic importance of achieving stability in the region and resolving the crisis through diplomatic means.
The security implications also extend to global alliances and defense strategies. NATO allies have expressed concern about the potential for conflict to spill beyond the Middle East, affecting international security arrangements. The US has reaffirmed commitments to its partners and deployed additional forces to the region as a deterrent against further aggression. Meanwhile, countries like China and Russia are watching closely, balancing their strategic interests with calls for diplomacy. Their involvement adds another layer of complexity to the geopolitical landscape, as they seek to expand influence while avoiding direct confrontation.
The intersection of these security and economic challenges highlights the urgent need for multilateral cooperation. Addressing the crisis requires not only managing immediate military tensions, but also tackling the underlying issues driving instability, such as nuclear proliferation, regional rivalries, and economic vulnerabilities. International organizations, governments, and civil society must work together to promote dialogue, rebuild trust, and develop frameworks that ensure security and prosperity for all. Failure to do so risks a prolonged conflict that could reshape the world order in unpredictable and dangerous ways.
For listeners following these developments, it is essential to understand that the impact of this crisis goes beyond headlines and political statements. It affects global markets, energy prices, security policies, and ultimately, the daily lives of millions around the world. Staying informed and supporting peaceful solutions contributes to a more stable and secure future. As we continue our coverage, we will explore how different countries and communities are coping with the fallout, what diplomatic options remain, and what lessons can be learned from this pivotal moment in history.
As tensions remain high following the U.S. strike on Iran's nuclear infrastructure, diplomatic efforts to defuse the crisis are underway, though the road ahead is fraught with challenges. The international community recognizes that while military action might temporarily delay Iran's nuclear ambitions, a long-term solution can only be achieved through dialogue and negotiation. Diplomatic channels are open but strained, reflecting years of mistrust and conflicting interests. In recent weeks, behind-the-scenes talks have taken place in neutral venues such as Switzerland and Qatar, where representatives from Iran, the US, and European nations meet to explore possible compromises. These discussions are delicate and complex, involving not just nuclear issues, but also sanctions relief, regional security concerns, and the future of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA.
One of the key sticking points in these negotiations is the question of sanctions. The US has imposed extensive economic sanctions on Iran, targeting its banking, oil, and shipping sectors. These measures have crippled the Iranian economy and heightened domestic pressure on the government. Tehran insists that sanctions must be lifted before it agrees to limit its nuclear activities again. However, many in Washington and allied capitals are wary of easing sanctions without clear, verifiable commitments from Iran. They fear that lifting restrictions too soon could enable Iran to advance its nuclear program covertly or increase its regional influence through proxy groups. This mistrust makes negotiations slow and difficult.
European countries, particularly France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, are playing a mediating role, seeking to bridge gaps between Tehran and Washington. The European Union has expressed commitment to preserving the JCPOA framework, viewing it as the best path to preventing nuclear proliferation while avoiding war. EU diplomats stress the importance of compliance on both sides and the need to rebuild trust gradually. At the same time, the US administration faces internal debates over the best approach. Some officials advocate for a hardline stance to pressure Iran into full compliance, while others argue for a more flexible strategy that includes phased sanctions relief tied to concrete nuclear concessions. These differing views complicate the formulation of a unified policy.
Iran's leadership is also divided between hardliners and moderates. Hardliners reject any deal perceived as a concession to Western pressure, emphasizing Iran's right to develop nuclear technology. Moderates, aware of the economic hardships caused by sanctions, are more open to dialogue if it leads to sanctions relief and economic recovery. This internal dynamic within Iran affects its negotiating posture. The Iranian government must balance domestic political pressures with international expectations. Any agreement must be acceptable not only to foreign governments, but also to powerful factions within Iran's political and military establishments.
Meanwhile, regional actors closely watch these diplomatic efforts. Countries like Saudi Arabia and Israel, which have expressed strong opposition to Iran's nuclear program, are skeptical of any deal that might allow Iran to maintain its nuclear capabilities. They lobby their allies, particularly the US, to maintain a firm stance. Israel, in particular, has signaled it will act independently if necessary to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, including potential preemptive strikes. This adds another layer of complexity and risk to the already fragile situation.
Despite these challenges, there have been some positive signs. Both Tehran and Washington have agreed to release some detainees and prisoners, signaling willingness to engage in confidence-building measures. These gestures, though small, indicate that communication channels remain open. International organizations such as the IAEA continue their monitoring work, striving to verify Iran's nuclear activities and report on compliance. Their presence provides a measure of transparency and accountability, which is crucial for sustaining any diplomatic progress.
Looking ahead, the prospects for diplomacy depend on several factors. Will the US and Iran find common ground on sanctions and nuclear limits? Can European countries maintain their mediating role amid pressure from their allies and constituents? How will regional powers influence the process? The answers remain uncertain. However, one thing is clear. Without serious diplomatic engagement, the risk of military escalation and broader conflict will increase. The stakes could not be higher, not just for the Middle East, but for global peace and security.
For ordinary people in the region and around the world, this moment is a reminder of how interconnected our futures are. Decisions made by leaders in Washington, Tehran, Brussels, and Riyadh will shape the course of history. It is essential to support efforts that prioritize peace, dialogue, and mutual understanding. As we continue this podcast series, we will explore more about the human impact of this crisis, the role of media and public opinion, and potential paths forward for lasting peace.
While the geopolitical and economic ramifications of the U.S. strike on Iran's nuclear facilities dominate headlines, it's important to remember the human dimension of this conflict. The people who live in the region, ordinary citizens, face uncertainty, fear, and hardship. Their stories are often overshadowed by political narratives, yet they are the heart of the crisis. In cities across Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria, families grapple with the consequences of ongoing tensions. Many experience disruptions to daily life, from power shortages to restricted movement. Markets and schools sometimes close amid security concerns, and the constant threat of violence weighs heavily on everyone's minds. These realities highlight that conflicts are not just about governments and armies, but about human lives.
Indeed, Adam. Beyond immediate physical dangers, the psychological impact on communities cannot be underestimated. Anxiety and trauma from years of conflict and instability affect mental health, with limited access to counseling or support services. Children grow up in environments where the sound of sirens or explosions becomes tragically normal. In addition, economic hardships caused by sanctions and disrupted trade hit the most vulnerable hardest. Inflation drives up the cost of food, medicine, and basic goods, pushing more families into poverty. Employment opportunities shrink as businesses close or relocate, leading to increased unemployment and social unrest.
These conditions can fuel resentment and radicalization, perpetuating cycles of violence. When people feel hopeless or marginalized, extremist groups may exploit their grievances. This underscores the urgent need for humanitarian aid and development programs alongside diplomatic and military strategies. At the same time, civil society organizations and local activists work tirelessly to support affected communities, promote dialogue, and foster resilience. Their efforts often go unrecognized, but are critical in building bridges and nurturing peace from the ground up.
Turning to media influence, the role of news outlets, social media, and information channels is powerful in shaping how this crisis is perceived worldwide. Media coverage can inform and educate, but also polarize and mislead, depending on sources and biases. Traditional media often focuses on dramatic events, strikes, protests, diplomatic statements, sometimes at the expense of deeper analysis or human stories. Sensational headlines may capture attention but can oversimplify complex issues or perpetuate stereotypes.
Social media platforms add another layer. They provide real-time updates and amplify voices from the region, but also spread misinformation and propaganda. Fake news can inflame tensions, spread fear, and distort facts. Governments and organizations are increasingly aware of the need to counter disinformation campaigns that can destabilize societies. Moreover, the digital divide means not everyone has equal access to accurate information. Some communities rely on word of mouth or limited local sources, making it harder to get a full picture of the situation.
Public opinion, influenced by media narratives, plays a significant role in shaping policy decisions. Governments often respond to the concerns and pressures of their citizens. When populations demand peace and stability, leaders are more motivated to pursue diplomatic solutions. However, nationalism, fear, and historical grievances can also harden attitudes and reduce the willingness to compromise. Media narratives that emphasize us versus them can deepen divides and make conflict resolution more difficult.
For international audiences, understanding the human stories behind the headlines is crucial. It encourages empathy and a nuanced view of the crisis. Documentaries, interviews, and first-hand accounts provide valuable perspectives that challenge stereotypes and highlight shared humanity. Educational initiatives and balanced reporting help foster informed public discourse. They empower people to engage constructively and advocate for peaceful solutions.
In this digital age, everyone can contribute to shaping the narrative. Sharing accurate information, listening to diverse voices, and supporting credible journalism are important ways to combat misinformation and promote understanding. As citizens of a global community, staying informed and empathetic enhances our collective ability to address crises peacefully. It reminds us that behind every policy and headline are real people whose lives are deeply affected.
In the final chapter of our series, we will explore potential pathways to peace and reconstruction. We will discuss how diplomacy, economic development, and grassroots efforts can work together to build a more stable and prosperous Middle East. Until then, we encourage our listeners to reflect on the stories they've heard and consider how each of us can contribute to a more peaceful world. Julia, one of the most critical aspects of this crisis is the wide range of reactions it has triggered across the Middle East and around the world. Every government, every regional power, and every international organization has responded based on its interests, alliances, and perspectives. Understanding these reactions helps us grasp the broader implications of this event. Right after the U.S. strike was reported, regional powers such as Saudi Arabia and Israel publicly expressed strong support for the action. Both countries have long viewed Iran's nuclear program as a significant threat to their national security. Saudi Arabia, for example, has called for strict measures to prevent Iran from gaining nuclear capabilities, emphasizing the need for a tough stance.
Yes, Adam. Israel's reaction was particularly vocal. Prime Minister and senior officials praised the strike as a decisive blow against nuclear proliferation. They argued that allowing Iran to advance its nuclear program unchecked would destabilize the region even further and pose a direct threat to Israeli security. However, these statements also raised concerns about potential escalations. Israel's military and intelligence agencies reportedly remain on high alert, anticipating possible retaliation from Iran or its allied militias. This heightened alertness has created a tense atmosphere not only in Israel, but also in neighboring countries.
On the other hand, countries like Turkey and Qatar took more cautious and diplomatic stances. Turkey, balancing its regional ambitions and relations with both the West and Iran, called for restraint and urged all parties to return to negotiations. It emphasized the importance of dialogue and peaceful resolution rather than military actions. Qatar also echoed similar sentiments, highlighting the risks of conflict spreading across the region. Both nations emphasized the need for international mediation to prevent further escalation.
International organizations also weighed in quickly. The United Nations Secretary-General expressed deep concern about the strike's implications for regional stability. He called for calm and urged all parties to engage in constructive dialogue. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, which monitors nuclear activities worldwide, reiterated its commitment to verifying Iran's compliance with the nuclear deal's terms. The agency's role has become even more critical in the wake of these developments, as it can provide independent assessments that help build international trust.
Meanwhile, Russia and China responded with strong criticism of the U.S. strike. Both countries have strategic partnerships with Iran and have repeatedly called for a diplomatic solution to nuclear disputes. They condemned the attack as a violation of international law and warned that such actions could lead to dangerous consequences. Russia emphasized that unilateral military actions undermine global security frameworks and complicate efforts to maintain peace. China, similarly, stressed the importance of respecting sovereignty and urged all parties to return to negotiation tables under international frameworks.
These contrasting responses reflect deeper geopolitical rivalries. Russia and China seek to assert their influence in the Middle East and challenge U.S. dominance. Supporting Iran aligns with their strategic interests. including access to energy resources and political alliances. At the same time, Western countries, including members of the European Union, were divided in their reactions. Some supported the US position, but called for caution to avoid triggering wider conflict. Others criticized the strike for its potential to derail diplomatic efforts and increase instability.
The European Union has historically tried to maintain a balanced approach, supporting the nuclear deal as a pathway to peace while opposing nuclear proliferation. Many European leaders warned that military actions could jeopardize years of diplomacy and reduce chances of reaching a comprehensive agreement with Iran. This division within the West illustrates how complex the issue is. Even allies have different priorities and approaches to security in the Middle East.
Public opinion in various countries also played a role in shaping government responses. In the US, some supported the strike as necessary to protect national and global security. Others criticized it as reckless and feared it could lead to a prolonged conflict with high costs. In Iran, the government portrayed the attack as an act of aggression and used it to rally nationalist sentiment. State media framed it as a violation of sovereignty and promised a strong response. At the same time, many Iranian citizens expressed concerns about the potential for war and its impact on their lives.
Social media amplified these diverse voices. Hashtags, videos, and posts spread rapidly, sometimes fueling nationalism and sometimes calling for peace. Disinformation and propaganda became challenges as well, with various groups trying to influence public opinion internationally. Governments and civil society actors increased efforts to monitor and counter false information. This battle for narratives is as important as any diplomatic negotiation, as it shapes how people perceive the conflict and their willingness to support peace initiatives.
It is important to recognize that regional and global reactions are interconnected. The Middle East is a nexus of international interests, and actions in one part can ripple across continents. This event has tested alliances and exposed fractures. It has reminded the world how fragile peace is and how essential coordinated efforts are to prevent conflict escalation.
In summary, the U.S. strike on Iran's nuclear infrastructure provoked a wide spectrum of reactions, from strong support to harsh condemnation. These responses reveal the competing interests, fears, and hopes of various actors. The challenge ahead is to transform these reactions into dialogue and cooperation rather than confrontation. Only through understanding and negotiation can the cycle of conflict be broken.
Next, we will explore the broader implications of this crisis on the global economy, energy markets, and international security frameworks. Stay with us as we continue to unravel this complex story.
Julia, one of the most immediate and far-reaching effects of the U.S. strike on Iran's nuclear facilities was its impact on the global economy and, more specifically, on energy markets. The Middle East is a critical supplier of oil and gas to the world, and any disruption or threat to the region's stability tends to send shockwaves through international markets. Right after news of the strike broke, global oil prices surged significantly. This was partly due to fears about potential retaliation from Iran, which could threaten shipping lanes and oil production facilities. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow but vital passageway through which a substantial percentage of the world's oil travels, became a key point of concern.
Exactly, Adam. The Strait of Hormuz is like the world's energy lifeline. Any threat to this passage has serious consequences for energy security worldwide. Iran has, in the past, threatened to close the strait if its interests were under attack, and such an action would drastically reduce the flow of oil, pushing prices even higher. The strike increased uncertainty among investors and traders, leading to volatility not only in oil markets, but also in stock exchanges globally. Markets are very sensitive to geopolitical risks, especially in energy-rich regions like the Middle East.
The spike in oil prices affected various sectors of the global economy. Higher energy costs translate into increased transportation and manufacturing expenses. This, in turn, can contribute to inflation, reducing consumers' purchasing power and slowing down economic growth. For countries heavily dependent on oil imports, particularly in Asia and Europe, the strike raised concerns about energy supply stability and affordability. Governments began to consider contingency plans, including increasing strategic petroleum reserves and seeking alternative suppliers.
At the same time, oil exporting countries in the region faced mixed outcomes. While higher prices could benefit their revenues, the instability risked damaging production infrastructure and investor confidence. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and the United Arab Emirates had to balance these competing pressures carefully. Moreover, international oil companies operating in the Middle East had to reassess their operations and security measures, increasing costs and complicating investment decisions.
The natural gas market was also affected, although to a lesser degree than oil. Iran is a significant gas producer, and any prolonged conflict could disrupt supply routes and contracts. This added to global energy market uncertainty, especially in Europe, where natural gas demand has been rising steadily. Beyond energy, the strike influenced trade routes and shipping insurance costs. The increased risks in the Gulf region led to higher premiums for vessels passing through the area, raising the cost of maritime trade. This had ripple effects on global supply chains, already strained by other geopolitical and economic challenges.
Financial markets reacted with caution. Investors often seek safe haven assets like gold, US Treasury bonds, and the Swiss franc during periods of uncertainty. Following the strike, there was a noticeable shift toward these assets, reflecting anxiety about potential escalations and economic disruption. Currency markets too showed volatility. The US dollar initially strengthened as investors perceived it as a safe asset, but fluctuations continued as the situation evolved.
Another important aspect was the reaction of global energy policy and long-term planning. The crisis highlighted the vulnerability of relying heavily on fossil fuels from geopolitically sensitive regions. Many countries reiterated the urgency of diversifying their energy sources, accelerating investments in renewables, energy efficiency, and alternative technologies. This event served as a catalyst for discussions about energy security, sustainability, and the geopolitical implications of the global energy transition.
International organizations such as the International Energy Agency, IEA, closely monitored the situation. The IEA called on member countries to coordinate responses, including releasing emergency oil stocks if necessary, to stabilize markets and ensure supply continuity. Energy cooperation among countries gained renewed attention, emphasizing the need for transparent communication and collective action to mitigate shocks.
Looking ahead, the strike's economic repercussions are not limited to the short term. Prolonged instability could deter foreign investment in the Middle East, slowing economic diversification efforts crucial for regional development. Countries affected by sanctions and conflict may find it harder to rebuild their economies and integrate into global markets, perpetuating cycles of poverty and unrest.
It is clear that the impact of this event extends far beyond military or political realms. The interconnectedness of global economies means that disturbances in one region can have cascading effects worldwide. For listeners, understanding these economic dynamics is vital to grasping the full scope of international crises. It is not just about politics or conflict, it is about how people's daily lives, from fuel prices to job opportunities, can be affected.
In conclusion, the U.S. strike on Iran's nuclear infrastructure sent ripples through global energy markets and economies. It underscored the fragility of energy supply chains and the complex relationship between geopolitics and economic stability. The path forward requires not only diplomatic solutions, but also strategic planning to ensure resilient and diversified energy systems that can withstand geopolitical shocks.
Next, we will explore how this crisis influenced international security frameworks and global diplomatic relations. Stay with us as we continue to unpack this multifaceted story.
Julia, after examining the economic consequences of the U.S. strike on Iran's nuclear infrastructure, it's essential to consider its impact on international security and diplomatic relations. This event did not occur in isolation. It has deeply influenced global security architecture, alliances, and the ways countries approach diplomacy. Historically, nuclear proliferation concerns have been a driving force behind many international security policies. Iran's nuclear program has long been a focal point of negotiations, sanctions, and strategic calculations. The U.S. strike represented a major escalation and sent a clear message about the lengths to which Washington is willing to go to prevent nuclear development in Iran.
Absolutely, Adam. The strike challenged established norms about how states should resolve nuclear disputes. Traditionally, diplomacy and multilateral agreements, such as the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, were the primary tools used to manage Iran's nuclear ambitions. With this military action, the US shifted the approach toward a more forceful and unilateral strategy. This shift has significant consequences for how the international community views conflict resolution and non-proliferation efforts.
The strike also tested key international security institutions and agreements. For example, the United Nations Charter emphasizes the importance of peaceful dispute resolution and prohibits the use of force except in cases of self-defense or with Security Council approval. Many critics argued that the strike violated these principles, raising questions about the legitimacy of unilateral military interventions. This debate has implications not only for Iran, but for global norms around sovereignty and the use of force.
Moreover, the strike complicated relations between the US and its traditional allies. European countries, as we discussed earlier, were divided on how to respond. Some supported US actions as a necessary measure against nuclear proliferation, while others worried that the strike undermined ongoing diplomatic efforts and risked escalating the conflict. This division challenged the unity of Western alliances, particularly NATO, which relies on shared values and coordinated policies. It also strained US relations with countries that favor diplomatic engagement over military action.
The situation has also influenced security alliances in the Middle East itself. The U.S. has several key partnerships in the region, including with Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. These alliances were reaffirmed in some cases by the strike, with partners expressing solidarity. However, the increased tensions also highlighted vulnerabilities. Some regional actors may seek to hedge their bets or pursue independent strategies to protect their interests. This creates uncertainty about the coherence and effectiveness of existing security arrangements.
In addition, Iran's response to the strike raised concerns about asymmetric warfare and proxy conflicts. Iran's network of allied militias and groups across the Middle East allows it to exert influence without direct confrontation. Retaliatory attacks against US interests or allies, cyber warfare, and sabotage could increase. These tactics complicate traditional concepts of state-to-state conflict and pose challenges for security planning.
On a broader scale, the strike has prompted countries around the world to reconsider their own security policies and diplomatic strategies. For some, it reinforced the idea that nuclear non-proliferation is a critical priority that may require hard power. For others, it underscored the risks of military escalation and the need to strengthen international institutions and dialogue mechanisms to prevent conflict.
This brings us to the role of diplomacy in the aftermath. While the strike disrupted existing negotiations, it also created an urgent impetus to restart dialogue to avoid further escalation. Back-channel communications, multilateral talks, and diplomatic shuttle efforts have intensified. Many states and international organizations are advocating for renewed negotiations that include security guarantees, inspections, and phased agreements.
Another dimension is the impact on arms control regimes. The strike has cast doubt on the future of arms control agreements globally, including those involving major powers like the US, Russia, and China. If unilateral military action becomes a preferred tool for dealing with perceived nuclear threats, it could undermine decades of arms control progress, encouraging other states to pursue their own nuclear capabilities or defensive measures.
Civil society and non-governmental organizations also play a role. Advocacy for nuclear disarmament, peace-building, and conflict prevention has gained renewed urgency. Public opinion in many countries increasingly favors diplomatic solutions and fears the catastrophic consequences of nuclear conflict. These voices are important for shaping government policies and international agendas.
In conclusion, the U.S. strike on Iran's nuclear infrastructure has profoundly affected international security and diplomacy. It challenged norms, tested alliances, and highlighted the complex balance between deterrence and dialogue. The coming months and years will be crucial in determining whether the world moves toward greater confrontation or renewed efforts for peace and stability.
Thank you for listening to this detailed discussion on international security and diplomacy. In our next chapter, we will explore the human and humanitarian impact of this crisis, focusing on civilians caught in the crossfire and the role of humanitarian organizations. Stay tuned as we continue to explore every dimension of this pivotal event.
As we reach the final chapter of our series on the turning point in the Middle East, it is important to shift our focus from conflict to hope. The situation remains complex and challenging, but history shows us that even the most difficult conflicts can lead to opportunities for peace and rebuilding. The question now is, what pathways can lead to lasting peace and reconstruction in the Middle East? One clear path is through sustained diplomatic engagement. Dialogue between all stakeholders, including the U.S., Iran, regional powers, and international organizations, is essential. Diplomatic efforts must be inclusive and sensitive to the diverse interests and concerns of the region's many actors. This means not only addressing security issues, but also economic and social dimensions that fuel conflict.
Absolutely, Adam. Another key pathway is economic development. The Middle East's economic challenges are deeply intertwined with its political instability. Sanctions, war damage, and disrupted trade have created cycles of poverty and unemployment, which undermines social cohesion. Investing in infrastructure, education, healthcare, and job creation can help address the root causes of conflict. International financial institutions, donor countries, and private sector partners all have roles to play in supporting sustainable development projects. Economic opportunity gives people hope for the future and reduces the appeal of extremist narratives.
Regional cooperation is also crucial. Countries in the Middle East share many common interests, including water management, trade, energy, and security. Initiatives that encourage collaboration on these fronts can build trust and interdependence. Multilateral forums and peace-building organizations can facilitate dialogue and joint projects. Such cooperation strengthens regional stability and provides a platform for addressing broader issues collectively rather than through confrontation.
Civil society organizations and grassroots movements are often the unsung heroes of peacebuilding. They work on the ground to promote dialogue, reconciliation, and community resilience. Supporting their work is vital for fostering social healing and bridging divides created by years of conflict. Education initiatives that teach conflict resolution, human rights, and civic engagement empower young people to become agents of change. Encouraging youth participation in political and social life helps build a foundation for peaceful societies.
International law and accountability mechanisms also play a significant role. Upholding human rights and ensuring justice for victims of conflict build legitimacy for peace processes. This requires cooperation between governments, courts, and international bodies. Transparent investigations into violations and fair trials contribute to healing and prevent cycles of revenge. A culture of respect for law and human dignity supports long-term peace.
The role of media and communication cannot be overstated. Promoting balanced reporting and amplifying voices of peace and reconciliation help counteract divisive rhetoric. Media literacy programs enable citizens to critically evaluate information and resist manipulation. Digital platforms can be harnessed to foster dialogue across communities and countries. Creative arts and cultural exchanges also promote understanding and shared identity beyond political differences.
Technology offers new tools for peacebuilding, from early warning systems that detect conflict signs to platforms for cross-border collaboration. Investing in innovation can enhance communication, education, and humanitarian responses. However, technology must be used responsibly, with safeguards against misuse or exacerbation of tensions. Partnerships between governments, civil society, and the tech industry are needed to maximize benefits and minimize risks.
Of course, challenges remain. Deep-seated mistrust, competing interests, and external influences complicate efforts toward peace. Progress is often slow and non-linear, requiring patience, resilience, and continuous commitment. But the alternative, continued conflict, carries devastating human and economic costs. The people of the Middle East deserve a future where security, prosperity, and dignity are realities, not just aspirations.
In conclusion, the turning point in the Middle East, marked by the U.S. strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, is both a moment of crisis and a chance for transformation. The choices made now will shape the region's trajectory for decades to come. Peace and reconstruction are possible, but only through a comprehensive approach that includes diplomacy, economic development, regional cooperation, civil society engagement, rule of law, media responsibility, and technological innovation.
Thank you for joining us throughout this podcast series on such a critical and complex topic. We hope our discussions have provided insight and encouraged reflection on the path forward for the Middle East. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement helps us continue delivering quality content that matters. Until next time, this is Adam and Julia from the English Globe, wishing you peace and understanding.